It's time for discussions. Welcome to the Discussions podcast. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So that's obviously not a definition. Like, that is just something that people quote. And if you ever look up a definition, it's going to explain something way more than that. And today we're going to be talking about critical thinking, because when I hear people say stuff like that quote we started with, it makes me think, have you really thought about this? Like, you got to think about whether something is really true or not. And it reminds me of that old fact that went around that said an average human eats 5.2 spiders per year. And how obviously everyone believed that because it was just a fact. But then we find out that it was a Harvard experiment testing out how fast information goes through the web. And I think that's kind of funny. And there's times where we don't use our critical thinking, and then there's times we may be using our critical thinking too much. For example, when the white and gold versus blue and black dress picture came up, I was really skeptical that anyone saw blue and black. I just assumed, after speaking to like my three closest friends, and I really trust them, and they all told me gold and white, I was thinking, anyone who says blue and black is just joking. They're just in on a joke. And this is kind of cool, because all you need to do to piss off people at a party is say blue and black, and then some people will start going crazy. So for ages, I thought that was just a joke, and it probably would have had the same effect even if it was a joke. But then I think years later, when I looked back on it, it actually is just the color and how people perceive color. And before filming this, I just watched a video saying, I Googled how to see the dress as blue and black, and the person kind of changed the exposure. And when he turned the exposure fully down, I could kind of see the blue as if the dress was no longer like a soft material, but like a blue leather. And I can kind of believe it now. So sometimes my critical thinking is wrong, plenty of times actually, and sometimes it's right. The times when it was right were when we were in Ibiza and we got into a fake taxi, and I told my friends we should definitely not be doing this, but they convinced me that it was definitely safe. And we almost got ripped off. Luckily we were okay. But that's an example of when you want to turn up that critical thinking just a little bit and think, what is really happening here? And an example of that, again, in Europe, was when we went to a hotel and it was time to park our car. And the person at the hotel said, don't use the on-street parking. There's private parking you can use here. And so because he was affiliated with the hotel, I trusted him. But then my friend said, Campbell, you got to think about if something's in it for him. He could be getting kickbacks. And then when we did the math, we're thinking, oh, it might actually be better to park in the street. And whether or not he was right, he got me thinking, I rarely ever consider other people's motives when they're giving me what feels like honest advice. But if we're going to be logical about it, we kind of should evaluate to some degree the person's motives. And those are just, I guess, social and personal examples of when critical thinking can come in handy. But in the business world and in the professional world, it's clearly going to give you benefits if you're able to look at concepts from both sides and think, what are the reasons that would make this true, and what are the reasons that would make this false? And my exposure to critical thinking came from when I did my honors year. When I did my honors year, I realized that everything that I studied in my bachelor's degree, everything that's in those textbooks that I studied and took for granted, that comes from journal articles and papers, kind of like scientific papers, but in the finance world, that propose an idea, and then there's other journal articles that propose another idea. So it showed me that, there might be 10 articles for an idea and 2 or 3 articles against it. But because that's got the popular opinion, it's kind of proven to be right in that sense, it gets put into the textbooks. And I've heard that research degrees and honors degrees, master's degrees can help you analyze that, because it shows you that, things just aren't crystal clear sometimes, and often there's 2 sides to every argument. So that brings us to, how can we improve our critical thinking if we want to? And I suggest that if that's something you do want to do, you just start practicing. Do a couple repetitions of it. Say, pick 5 things, the next 5 things you hear, and say, I'm going to weigh up both sides of the argument. What is in my knowledge would make me think this is true, and what in my knowledge would make me question this, including maybe considering the motives or the worldview, the perspective of the person who gave you the information. Back in the old days, I think storytelling was how we passed on information, so you would trust someone else completely. And I can think of some of my older friends who operate like that. I remember an older person, when they wanted to work out how to use an iPhone better, they called my friend who works at the iPhone store, the Apple store. And that made me laugh. But in essence, that's how things used to be done. If you needed some knowledge about how to use a radio, you'd call someone who works at the radio store, or you'd contact your friend who's in the radio store. So that relies on kind of not thinking critically, because you have to trust that person. But these days, we have the internet. We can get both sides of the argument super quickly. So that's a reason that that makes critical thinking more possible these days. So if you want to improve your critical thinking, just try this out. Try applying thinking for and against an idea and come up with, say, 3 reasons that the idea could be true and 3 reasons that the idea could be false. And then when you balance them out, you'll be able to choose whether to believe it or not. But what that's going to do for you is kind of get that critical thinking to be a habit. And it'll become a really quick calculation in the future. And when you're given something, a piece of information that's important, and it's important for you to pick a stance on it, you'll be able to evaluate both sides fairly, and you'll be able to make better decisions at work, in your personal life, etc. So critical thinking is a good skill. It is supplemented by a base of knowledge that'll help you kind of understand things better. But I don't think knowledge is essential for it in that sense, or general knowledge. I think the ability just to have the flexibility of your mindset to analyze both sides of the argument is more important here. So thank you for joining us, and subscribe so we can bring you more content.